go into some of the method of the paper itself as well later on. But Goldie, I just wanted to start by asking you, reflecting on this text that we've read together. Can you speak about your journey in relation to the concept of decolonization?
Thank you, Sadhvi. I think it's fair to say that my journey with the concept hasn't been a linear process. It's nice to say that because I think, in a way, it speaks to the spirit of Tuck and Yang's article. I think it should be something that is disruptive, the idea of decolonization itself, and going back to Fanon as a program of disorder, if you will. Um, sorry, there's something that says confirming your speaking language, which I will ignore. But anyway, so for me, decolonization as a way of thinking about transforming the world, as a way of dismantling oppressive colonial systems, has actually made me continually rethink my understanding of the world, but also my understanding of my own positionality. So, for example, I have journeyed from understanding myself as a quote unquote post colonial Indian origin racialized migrant to the US to understanding myself as a settler benefiting from settler colonial systems in Turtle Island, what we call the US, and also when I moved to indigenous lands in what we call Australia. Um, and then I will talk about my more recent work in relation to Kashmir and also as a colonial subject, Indian subject in relation to Kashmir. And I'll briefly speak about that a little later. So when I started graduate school at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, I was taking a post-colonial literature class, and having been a migrant to the US in the late 80s, experiencing racialization and racism, the vocabulary of anti-racism and colonial histories resonated with my own personal life history, biography as an Indian Christian growing up in India, and my parents' I would say downward mobility migrant experience in the US. During grad school, we read Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and the book that resonated strongly with me at that time was Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, a book that speaks to the economic and cultural layers of colonialism and anti-colonialism. And of course, Ngugi is a Fanonian Marxist. So at the time, I would have understood this form of decolonization as an anti-colonial struggle against colonialism in general, rather than, in more specific terms as settler colonialism. So although I knew of and had colleagues from the Wampanoag Confederacy at UMass Amherst, so I knew of Native American movements in the US. I think my understanding of decolonization in relation to struggles around land became much sharper in the context of indigenous struggles in what we call Australia, or the island continent of Australia. So I think in part, if I were to reflect on it, in part, I think this became sharper to me because I moved there in 1996, and there were daily sort of assaults against indigenous land rights that were being fought in the courts at the time. I think what was being fought for was native title, which is a very watered down version of land rights. And this was being covered daily in the Australian press. And this is the time when the Liberal Prime Minister John Howard had just won the elections. And so, any ceding of any ground to even native title was constantly being attacked, at the same time as, daily assault against anything to do with multiculturalism. So, as a consequence of this, there was a sense of political urgency. And at the time, I decided to do my dissertation on how Indigenous issues were being covered on Australian television news. So, for over a decade of living in that island continent, due to the political and intellectual education I received from both Indigenous and non Indigenous mentors, I began to understand how post colonial theory and discourse could also colonize indigenous land rights struggles in the name of, speaking about decolonization. So there's an excellent article by Eileen Morton Robinson. It's called I Still Call Australia Home, Indigenous Belonging and Place in a Post Colonizing Society. And this article is in the book Uprootings, Regroundings, Questions of Home and Migration. It was published in 2003, edited by Ahmed Scheller and Castaneda. And so, this idea of speaking about decolonization and colonization, but ignoring indigenous land rights in that equation, but also thinking about, in fact, I used to be at conferences and they would be talking about Australia as a post-colonial society. And so this kind of became very jarring. And so it really became important to think about what does decolonization mean in this context. And so in the article, in Tuck and Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, they address this quite well in their argument, where they speak of the ways in which decolonization becomes a contradictory, in quotes, desire for people of color from post-colonial contexts. And they argue that the promise of integration and civil rights, again, this is a quote, is predicated on securing a share of settler appropriated wealth as well as expropriated third world wealth. And so, for peoples from post colonial contexts who are racialized migrants, the question of integrating into the settler state and or asserting rights and anti-racism can be something to fight for, but often disavowing the fact that they are contributing to and benefiting from settler colonialism that has dispossessed indigenous nations, peoples, and also struggles. So for me, this brings up a question. I mean, I'll speak to some of this a little later again, but I wanted to sort of ask Sadhvi, about your own journey in relation to decolonize, in terms of this concept of decolonization, but also in terms of the relationship between researching race and decolonization. So, what has been your journey and your experience in thinking these things together?
Oh, thank you. Um, and yeah, I think how you sort of touched on the article and your own journey sort of prompts us, doesn't it, to sort of um, bring kind of self-accountability and self-reflection to the fore here as a method of decolonizing the mind, as Ngugi kind of uh, invites us to do. Um, I think for my journey, I think sort of, so I was born and brought up in the UK in London, and my parents were born in the new post-colonial capital of India, Delhi. Um, their their parents migrated during the um, during independence and the creation of India and Pakistan, and so migrated from what is now Pakistan into India. So growing up in London, we were surrounded actually by our parents, but also our grandparents. We lived in an extended family, and I can't talk about my journey to decolonization without talking about these family narratives. Because I think that was my first education on decolonizing, albeit through um, a slippery narrative which accentuates a binary between the colonizer and the colonized. And by that I mean there were moments and ruptures in that binary when my grandmother in particular would talk about caste privilege, would talk about Hindu supremacy, but then bring it back to this kind of self-righteousness as well, right? Which undoes the moment of rupture, if you like. So growing up, I think I was mostly um, interested in how some of these narratives and insights weren't creating this perfect story of subjugated post-colonial folks bringing about their independence and then coming to the UK as economic migrants, those stories ruptured and were contradicted throughout. And I think part of the sort of intellectual interest in decolonization arose precisely because of paying attention and observing and listening to those contradictions. And I think decolonizing is, I think certainly, I mean, as Tuck and Yang would argue, it we cannot talk about decolonization without talking about land. And I think that it has not been straightforward, I think, in the UK, being aware of what that means for the racialized migrant in the UK. So, what does land and land relations mean for someone like me? There is a greater propensity, because there is such a huge cultural manufacturing of this, that I have nothing to do with the settler colonialism of America, of Australia, and so forth, right? So it takes a few moves to get out of that innocence, as Tuck and Yang would refer to it, to understand my role in um, um, having privilege and access to the great wealth that has provided me a space in the UK that I extract and exploit. So I think making those jumps has been a journey. I think I started off somewhere which was very self-righteous, and I've become more and more critical of that position as I've moved forward. But I think that's a far more generative and potentially solidaristic way of um, engaging with decolonizing literature and its politics. But to your point, sorry, you asked me about how decolonization and race are interconnected, and I think Tuck and Yang here are really important for us to engage with, isn't it? Because they actually talk about race and decolonization having quite a complex relationship and a non-equivalent relationship as well. Um, and they kind of critique, I think, how a lot of racial justice frameworks are kind of conflated with decolonization without paying attention to what these different sorts of movements and ideas bring to us. Um, and maybe one of their key points is that decolonization specifically refers to indigenous sovereignty and land repatriation and the return of these lands to indigenous peoples, and that racial justice efforts are important. But I think, Goldie, as you've actually highlighted, can also operate within these colonial, settler colonial constructions of citizenship and rights to property. Um, so I think the paper kind of helps us to see how colonial systems use these racialized categories and hierarchies um, as ways to maintain settler dominance. Um, and I think that's why they want to emphasize that addressing racism alone doesn't constitute decolonization. Um, and and that's kind of where they begin to, I think, start to highlight the caution us, I should say, against these settler moves to innocence, because this is where racial justice work can become a substitute for for that more uncomfortable work um, that land restitution involves. Um, but yeah, I mean, would you like to sort of maybe say something else on that in that relationship?
Yeah, no, I think you, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think you sort of beautifully put that, like just talking about racial justice alone can be a move to innocence, as you know, I think that's one of the key points in that article. And I think, I mentioned earlier about learning from, I suppose, Indigenous and non-Indigenous mentors. I was thinking of Indigenous scholar activists like Gary Foley, Eileen Morton Robinson, Irene Watson, non-Indigenous scholar activists like Svendrini Pereira or Joseph Pugliese, and who at the time especially in the 90s, I would say, were prolifically writing about race, racism, racialization, but always articulating it with the 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 um, articulating it in relation to indigenous sovereignty and land rights. So yeah, so it's like it was never a separate kind of thing, that these things were being talked about together at the same time as emphasizing how indigenous sovereignty was not something to be lumped in as a multicultural issue. So I think for me, my whole journey toward sort of focusing on sovereignty studies kind of comes from there or emerges from there. And also, I mean, this is more like, a by the way point, because at the time I thought we were not kind of talking about settler colonial theory as some established thing. We were talking about colonialism, but we're also talking about indigenous sovereignty and land rights. I mean, I think there are scholars who have talked about this issue, that, people, indigenous people, scholars of race and color have been talking about these issues long before settler colonial theory becomes a more established kind of thing. So we need to remember that as well. So race and its articulations were discussed in relation to land rights, but also in relation to thinking about solidarities and alliances. And I think for me, I think at the, and I'm talking about this particular period, that journey was also one of engaging in and witnessing transnational solidarities. So, my own experience was with me working with a group of activist scholars in Sydney at different times on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation. There were meetings led by the late Uncle Ray Jackson, who was a Wiradjuri elder who had formed the Indigenous Social Justice Association. So one of the events that we participated in and organized by the Indigenous Social Justice Association was to speak out against the then government's hardline stance against asylum seekers coming to Australia. And I remember participating in a passport ceremony where we handed out Aboriginal passports to all those who recognized Indigenous sovereignty. So these kinds of alliances and solidarities were also, I guess, in a broader way, articulations of thinking about both racial justice in relation to Indigenous sovereignty. I guess that's like an example. And also remembered at the time rallies for Palestinian freedom, and as a ongoing solidarity between Indigenous and Palestinian activists. And those forms of transnational solidarities, of course, are even more important in the current context, in the face of the highly militarized neoliberal forms of settler colonial techniques deployed against Indigenous peoples in the Australian context, or in Gaza and the West Bank, and in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, for example. So, in many ways, for me, it was a time of thinking about what anti-colonialism could mean in the present through these kinds of solidarities. So, I suppose, I guess I don't know if this is just a really minor sort of difference or not, but I think in the Tuck and Yang article, they do offer a valid critique of the kind of anti-colonialism, which, I think they're referring to they're referring to an article which talks about the journey of Filipino subjects following stolen resources by coming to the US as migrants. And then they talk about that journey as, quote, empowered post-colonial subjects who sees denied privileges from the metropole, end of quote. But for me, I think with that kind of experience that I had, that I've been talking about, anti-colonialism and decolonization are not necessarily different things if we understand how settler colonialism produces indigeneity and the need to acknowledge, and when we ally ourselves or think about solidarity, which is never an easy process, it's always an unsettled and difficult and vigilant kind of process, but it is a solidarity about acknowledgement in settler colonial context of indigenous sovereignty and the struggles around land. So in this sense, somebody like Dean Sarah Neal's article in the Hawaiian context, why Asian settler colonialism matters is quite an important kind of article to read in thinking about how, I guess, in thinking about how, uh, what are our political acts when we are in those contexts or in a colonial context? Like, what kinds of solidarities, alliances do we make? So I think that's an important point to think about. There's also, I just wanted to mention an excellent book that has been published by Nishant Upadhyay called Indians on Indian Lands, which examines how caste and Brahminical supremacy plays a role in the processes of Indians in settler colonial states like the US or Canada. And so we might think a lot about, or we might think about how a lot of post colonial scholarship um, can be understood as caste knowledge production, right? By uh, and speaking to those decolonization contradictory desires, as Tuck and Yang put it. So these are, I think, many directions, projects, and debates that expand our thinking about how we research race in relation to settler colonialism.
That was so rich. Thank you so much, Goldie. Um, and I'd love for us to maybe think about because they do talk about solidarity. I think this is actually a really key point of the paper and maybe the method of the paper as well in the way that it seeks to unsettle, doesn't it? But I mean, there's so many ideas in the paper, isn't there? Is there something, um, an idea in particular that you'd like to sort of highlight or respond to in the paper, Goldie?
Thanks, Sadvi. I think this is an obvious point, and I feel like everybody in the room has probably read this paper and knows what I'm talking about. So, but I just want to kind of flesh it out a little bit. The obvious point, of course, is that when we say decolonization is not a metaphor, it is that, we're thinking about decolonization as a material thing, right? It's not something that is only epistemic, intellectual, all of those kinds of things, which can then lead people in different directions, but also, proclaim or be moves of innocence, as they put it. So, but I think there are cautions with the idea of decolonization or the concept of decolonization. So, what I mean, I agree with Tuck and Yang that this is about a material. It's a material thing that we need to kind of think about, not just as an epistemic project, but when we think about decoloniality and its emphasis on delinking knowledge and de-Westernization, and I'm thinking more of the Walter Mignolo understanding of decoloniality, I feel like there needs to be other cautions about how, in post-colonial contexts, you know, post-colonial states can also be colonial and, in fact, settler colonial. And so, with Tuck and Yang's article, they sort of more make the distinctions of external colonialism and internal colonialism. But I think rather than those distinctions, we need to think about how post-colonial states can be actually settler colonial or can be colonial. So just a quick example, and maybe some of the people in the room may already know this example, but Walter Mignolo endorsed Hindu supremacist text, 2021 text called India, that is Bharat, which was published by Bloomsbury Press. So the book's blurb describes decoloniality. It describes itself as a decolonial text, and talks about decoloniality as a civilizational imperative, and apparently offers an alternative to a Western understanding of Indian history as Hindu history, right? But in that text, like, decoloniality is about constructing an Indian Hindu Brahminical civilizational past, and one that casts Muslims, Christians as invaders, but also it's based on, those hierarchies of caste. And so Mignolo endorsed the book and then de-endorsed it once it was pointed out that the book was a Hindu supremacist book. So I think in that context, decolonization is not a metaphor also reminds us of the contemporaneity of postcolonialism in the postcolonial context, not as a legacy, not as solely an epistemic project, but as a colonial present, as a material struggle for land. So I guess this is where, I would reference some of the work done by people doing critical Kashmir studies kind of work. So I would I would consider myself as an Indian subject, as an ally, but also as a colonial subject in that context. Um, Thinking about how the Indian state has engaged in post-colonizing the Indian administered state of Jammu and Kashmir. Um, since 1947, scholars have argued that India's relationship to Kashmir can be characterized as a settler colonial imaginary with settler colonial desires. Settler colonial techniques were already being practiced, as scholars Mushtaq and Amin have argued, since 1947. And then since the removal of Kashmir's autonomy in 2019, settler colonial techniques and practices have been formalized, through changes to law, which enable changing demography in the Kashmir Valley through the sale of domicile certificates to Indian settlers, but also land that was you know, that could only be owned by Kashmiris being sold to Indian settlers. So reports of these can be found on the Kashmir Law and Justice Project web pages, and I can put that in the chat if people are interested. But also, I, some of you might want to learn more. I mean, there are handbooks that one can read, and uh, you know, uh, if you're interested more in learning, I mean, one handbook that can be recommended is the Routledge Critical Kashmir Studies Handbook, published in 2023. So these are just some of the things that these are more like cautions, but also, while that point is really important, I think there are cautions to be thought through when we talk about decolonization. I think there's another article which also came out as a as a critical commentary on the Tuck and Yang article. I think it's the Garba and Sorrentino 2020 article called "Slavery is a Metaphor," and then but I think their main critique there is that um, decolonization is not a metaphor, cites Black authors, but subsumes the figure of the slave into the native settler dyad. And then, what role does slavery play? If the figure of the slave enables the very possibility of the settler to accumulate land and wealth, then one cannot just subsume this figure into the dyad of native and settler, even though Tuck and Yang are talking about a triad between the figure of the slave and the native and the settler. But I think, there are others that are talking about colonial racial capitalism and settler colonialism together, the Koshi Gasho, Bird, and Jefferson book, for example. So I imagine that there's a lot of generative work being done and that is expanding and thinking through this articulation of these different, I guess, these different kinds of oppressive systems that need to be expanded on further. So, obviously there are many directions in which we can sort of expand and move, but I was thinking, I mean, Sadhvi, you've been mentioning method all along. So maybe you can maybe you can offer us a few sort of insights in relation to thinking about methods in decolonization is not a metaphor.
Yeah, thank you, Goldie. And yeah, I like to think about the paper as method, the article as method. And when we start to look at these texts as method and what that means even, I think it can open up really important affective dimensions of the dynamic that's being created as the reader of the text, and even the knowledge of that text as it speaks to us and how it's formed and reformed. And I think the paper, I think it's really interesting because it's a conceptual piece, and yet it's kind of written. If we're looking at the method of its writing and the presentation, it actually draws on all these different kinds of anecdotes, um, cultural artifacts from films, books, theatre, um, through to academic and intellectual ideas, in a way, kind of recovering storytelling, I think, by doing this in the way that the text presents itself to us. Um, and this storytelling is sort of begins, if I remember correctly, with Eve Tuck kind of reflecting on her giving a presentation on decolonizing to a audience of scholars, and she wants to sort of talk about the urgency, the sort of the need for orienting and situating land rights in these decolonizing frameworks. And she finds that everyone's like just nodding away in the audience in agreement. And her reaction is like, no, you need to be upset by what I'm saying. This needs to interrupt the way that you're thinking, because otherwise the work of decolonizing, which is this incommensurability, I think that's kind of quite a central component of even the method of how the argument is being laid out, means that one needs to create a disturbance or some sort of unsettling in that dynamic. And that actually this is not, it's an actual opening, because that rupture creates something that can then um, lead to more difficult conversations and dialogues. And I think that's a really important part of the method of the paper, which is it's written sometimes with confrontational language, and it's written with provocations. And I think that that's a really important part, I think, of the method of how they're um, trying to um, interrupt the ease with which we're intellectualizing decolonization. Um, I also think that the way that it's written, um, I think the sort of solutions are problematized. So even whilst I think it's taking quite a intellectual or sort of, I should say, recognizable approach to laying out critique, actually the solution is always undermined by the return to an interruption or a problematization um, of the not knowing, if you like, of the unforeseen. Um, so I think these sorts of the paper almost kind of embodies this uncomfortable truth that decolonizing can't be easily integrated into our um, existing knowledge systems. That's something new, as Fanon kind of reminds us, and how they recall Fanon as well throughout the paper, that the new emerges from the structures breaking down and regenerating. Um, Goldie, do you have some reflections on the method of the paper?
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily a methods person, but I will say a couple of things. Which is for me, I think what is interesting is um, I find it interesting about this the way that the structure of the paper, and I think I mean, everyone has a structure to their papers. You sort of divide it up and you speak to each point. But I think what was really nice about this particular paper is the point system. Like it was literally like, okay, these are the ways we're going to do it. And so I sort of put it together, settler moves to innocence, hybridization of decolonial thought. I mean, these are all the ways in which decolonization can become metaphorical, right? And then they talk about settler colonial equivocation, that is describing different groups as equally colonized, so differentiation between anti-colonial critique, decolonial framework, decolonization as a critical consciousness project. So freeing your mind and the rest will follow. So obviously, the counter to that is attention to materiality, repatriation of indigenous lands as central, right? Rather than just this critical consciousness. So in a way, all of that is also critique of activist movements that don't take into account indigenous issues in settler colonial context. And also they say that the anti-colonial turn towards the transnational can ignore the settler colonial. So where are you located when you make those transnational solidarities and all of those kinds of things? So I found this sort of point system in a way I good because it kind of somehow it conveys that literality of the non-metaphorical, right? And I suppose for me, it's also a method in a different way. So it's a method like almost like an activist guide. So like a scholar activist guide. Like, so if you think about that method, it is about like, okay, this is not decolonization. This is not I mean, I think one of the critiques was that there is a negativity to the article. And this is the slavery is a metaphor article, which kind of critiques it and says there's a negativity to it because everything is this is not, this is not, this is not. But I find that quite useful, because there is a positivity, which is, around land struggles and the materiality of that. So yeah, so for me, in that sense, it's a method of engaging with the world too, or it's offering a method of engaging with the world. So yeah, I
Thank
don't,
you.
I don't
Yeah,
know if it's a theoretical person's method
yeah,
inside.
no, I think it's useful for us
Mm.
to remind ourselves that methods aren't just talking about how much data we've collected in the participants of our study, but also to think about the ontology and epistemologies, dare I say it, that are the foundation, right, from which we then make our worlds appear in the research. So, but we're coming to the end of our guided prompts and conversation, and I just wanted to offer Goldie, we've sort of been talking about the materiality of decolonization, and I just thought, would you be able to give us just some of the like the current debates that we need to pay attention to about decolonization, things that are happening right now that students may be interested in engaging with?
So yeah, thanks for that, Sadhvi. I mean, I think we're in a geopolitical moment where even decolonization as metaphor, even curriculum reform projects or critical consciousness projects are being attacked and under threat. And I think here, Tuck and Young's decolonization is not a metaphor, might be read in a different direction as something that is not just in the danger of co-optation, but something that is really being attacked as a way to completely erase any project with anti-colonial possibilities. Conversely, we can read Tuck and Young's clarity about decolonization as a guide toward liberation struggles as more than ever necessary against a system of geopolitical settler colonial networks whose liberal gloves are off. So here I think when we think about decolonization, it is becoming even more significant, I think. So decolonization is perhaps necessarily anti-colonial and anti-fascist in a time when anti-Semitism, which was used by European fascism in the 20th century to murder Jewish populations en masse in Europe, is now being used by settler states to besmirch Palestinian allied activism of anti-racists, anti-Zionists, and anti-colonialists and indigenous allies and struggles as well. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism which must be decried, but it is telling when states decide to use anti-Semitism cynically against anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles, that we need to pay attention to that. I mean, I'd refer you to Ilana Lenton's really wonderful article on anti-Semitism, a proxy war on racism, So in that article, Lentin addresses what she calls state philo-Semitism, or false love for Jews that exceptionalizes anti Semitism. Lentin contrasts this with what real philo-Semitism might look like, that is, an inclusion of anti Zionist Jews, Black Jews, Jews of color, and those who do not fit into a template of what the modern Jewish subject of the post Holocaust is supposed to look like. And I think, I was saying a bit earlier, like the way that decolonization is being attacked, like Elon Musk's post on X in November 2023 said something like, decolonization is genocide. And, I would use that as an example of cynically deploying philo-Semitism to demonize decolonizing struggles. Musk's post was about the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," as if it were calling for the genocide of Jewish peoples. So the Decolonized Palestine web pages speak of the history of that slogan. Their website states that, quote, "When Palestinians call for freedom from the river to the sea, they're calling for decolonization and the dismantling of this racist colonial entity which dominates their lives and seeks to replace it with a state that would not exist at the expense of the subjugation of others," right? So this decolonization as genocide discourse is being mobilized by Musk as as a fascist and as an anti-Semite, because Musk, I think many of you would have seen those images of Musk's triumphalist fascist salute at Donald Trump's inauguration celebrations, made twice. That kind of gesture, and we know of Musk's support for the far-right Alternative for Germany party. In 2023, Musk shared an anti Semitic conspiracy theory post about Jewish populations pushing hatred for white people. So these are the people that are mobilizing, or these are the philo Semites, and what Alana Lentin would call like state or state allied kind of philo Semites. So there is also a really a good article critiquing Musk on this, Priyamvada Gopal's article on interpreting decoloniality as hate speech, as Musk does. And sort of, this is just a quote from Gopal's article. She says, "Taking a concept, turning it into its opposite is an old establishment strategy to discredit challenges to injustice. This crude tactic has been wielded against all emancipatory movements. Recall, for instance, the predictable claim that Black Lives Matter, an anti-racist movement, was in fact racism directed at white people. The women's movement, feminism's challenging of misogyny, has long been attacked as man-hating and misandry. By the same logic, decolonization is tarred with the brush of its opposite, colonization, the execution of which has frequently entailed genocidal killings and mass dispossession." So, I don't need to explain that to this audience, perhaps, but this is something that I think we need to bear in mind. So, we need to understand as readers that dismantling colonial systems is about indigenous struggles in relation to land in settler colonial contexts. And I would argue that Tuck and Yang's article really explores how not to decolonize in their article. And, this is really significant in this particular geopolitical time because we need to sort of really, yeah, that comes to the forefront, right? The idea of land struggles, and especially in relation to Palestine, for example. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're going to just close our conversation, and Shirley's going to step in to moderate questions